Welcome everybody to Innovative Energy Consultants webinar on cracking the code, the NHS Supplier CRP. So CRP stands for Carbon Reduction Plan. Here's the agenda. So today, I'm just going to introduce ourselves and Innovative Energy Consultants. We're going to talk about the objectives of this training session, introduce the NHS Net Zero Roadmap, talk about CRP requirements, and then give you an intro on how to create an outstanding CRP that will help you get those NHS tenders. So starting with introductions, my name is Eleanor Akers. I'm the founder and director of Innovative Energy Consultants. Innovative Energy Consultants is an award-winning, certified carbon literate sustainability strategy consulting organization. That was a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully you all followed. So we provide services like carbon footprinting, development of sustainability strategies. We also help companies build carbon reduction plans. And the purpose of this webinar really is just to give everybody an overview into how to do this and a bit of a taster on how we can help you meet the requirements of the NHS, because as you may or may not be aware, this is a fairly new requirement for suppliers to the NHS. So objectives for today are going to introduce the Net Zero Roadmap, break down the requirements of the carbon reduction plan, and then give you some tips on how to make it stand out. So NHS have a net zero roadmap. This is it. So it came into force in April 2022, and it started with a requirement for all tenders to have a minimum 10% weighting for net zero and social value. And this year it became a little bit more stringent. Any contracts with a value above £5 million are required to include a carbon reduction plan for their direct emissions. And we'll get into what direct emissions are a little bit later on. But for those of you familiar with the terminology, that's your scope 1 and your scope 2 emissions. And starting next year, in April 2024, all suppliers, regardless of the value of contract, will be required to publicly report on their emissions and publish a carbon reduction plan. So I think most people on this call are either already supplying the NHS or are working with businesses that will be supplying the NHS. So this will start to affect your sort of day-to-day operations, in that in order to get the business, you will be required to provide a CRP. April 2027, the scope of this increases. So instead of just looking at direct emissions, you'll be looking at all your indirect emissions as well. So that's really broadening what's included in your carbon footprint and your carbon reduction plan. And then by April 2028, you'll have to break that down by product line. So you can see every iteration, it's getting a little bit more specific. And by 2030, the NHS will no longer be able to buy from suppliers that are not aligned with the strategy. And so it really is worth getting a head start on this process to make sure that your business will be able to sell to the NHS for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And this is all with the goal of NHS having a net zero supply chain by 2045. So the UK has a legally binding target of being net zero by 2050. The NHS has decided to be a little bit more ambitious, and they've set their net zero target at 2045 for their entire supply chain. So this is where we are today. So some of you may be required to provide a carbon reduction plan for direct emissions already. But if you're not already required to do so, you probably will be by next year. So the purpose of this webinar, as I say, is just to introduce what a carbon reduction plan is so that you can continue to sell to the NHS. So every organisation that's requiring a CRP probably has very slightly different requirements. And today we're really going to focus on the NHS's requirements. But if anybody is putting together a carbon reduction plan for another customer that has slightly different requirements, please don't hesitate to get in touch and we'll help you out. Just to kind of provide a bit of context, this is a direct quote from the NHS Chief Executive. "We are committed to tackling climate change by reducing our emissions to net zero. In doing so, our aim is to be the world's first net zero national health service." So it's an incredibly ambitious plan. Nowhere in the world is pushing this quite as strongly as the UK is today. So for any of you that are selling internationally, if you're aligned with the UK requirements, you'll be well placed to align with requirements in other markets, including the US, Canada, Singapore, Australia. So first question, what is a carbon reduction plan? A carbon reduction plan is a way for a business to say, this is where we are today, these are our emissions, and this is how we're going to get to net zero. So that journey, because you're not going to do all these things overnight. You're not going to be able to turn up tomorrow and implement solar panels, renewable packaging, renewable transportation, all of these key components. So the point of a carbon reduction plan is to help you as a business set out all the different steps that you're going to take and have a plan, a time-bound action plan showing how you're going to drive your emissions down to net zero. The NHS introduced this requirement to align with the UK net zero emissions law. It's an extension of the public procurement note 0621. So if any of you are selling to government, that's national or local, you may have already been required to produce something very similar. And it's in line with the NHS's commitment to be net zero by 2045. For those of you who've not looked at carbon footprints before, there is more information in the appendix, including a link to our blog where we set out in a bit more detail the different sources of emissions. But the way that it's typically thought about is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So do you remember when we looked at the roadmap, today's requirement for direct emissions, which is scope 1. That's anything burnt on site. So that could be petrol, it could be diesel in a vehicle owned by your company. Most commonly, it's going to be natural gas in the heating systems used, offices, at factories. Some of you with more industrial processes, you might be burning natural gas on site. Scope 2 is indirect emissions, and these are typically associated with electricity, but also with purchased steam. So if you're running an industrial process, you may also be purchasing steam. And then your scope 3 is your indirect emissions. So that could be things like employees commuting to work. It could be things like business travel. It could be the transportation and distribution of your products. So if you were selling a medical device that the NHS was using in hospitals around the country, there's emissions associated with getting it from your manufacturing site to the hospitals across the country. And when we talk about carbon emissions, carbon is just really a shorthand. There's 7 sources of greenhouse gases that we need to monitor in our carbon reduction plans. Carbon dioxide is the most common. There's also methane, nitrous oxides, hydrofluorocarbons. I can't even remember what the other acronyms are for, but long chain hydrocarbon chemicals with global warming potential. But most common is carbon dioxide and methane. So what are you required to do to produce a carbon reduction plan? You've got to create it, you've got to publish it on your website, and it must be signed off at an appropriate level within 12 months of the procurement date. So it's no good asking the graduate to put this together and put it on the website and never looking at it. It must be signed off at director level, sometimes at board level. So that requirement is in place to create visibility within the company, because the NHS has put this in place in order to help its suppliers become net zero. And one of the ways to do that is to create visibility and engagement at all levels within the company. It must also include a signed declaration confirming the supplier's commitment to achieving net zero by 2050. As we noted before, the NHS has a goal of 2045, but the requirement is only 2050. So that's really put in place because the NHS recognises that it can't really be asking its suppliers to do better than the legal mandate of 2050. But if you can put a plan in place to get you to net zero by 2045, it will stand out. It will be viewed as better by the NHS. Carbon reduction plan must include a baseline carbon footprint. So if you're going to take 2021 as your baseline year, that would be your carbon footprint for all your operations in 2021. So looking at any natural gas, any petrol, diesel that were burned in vehicles owned by the company, looking also at your scope 2, And there's a defined subset of Scope 3 emissions. So that's not in place for this year, but we do recommend that everybody does it now to be prepared for future requirements. And you must also detail the environmental management measures applied to the delivery of the contract. So if you've done anything like switch to a biodegradable packaging or switch to a delivery company that uses electric vehicles rather than petrol or diesel vehicles, having all of this noted down is a requirement of the CRP. There are a few circumstances in which this is not required. So if you are a subcontractor to the supplier of the NHS, you don't need to provide the CRP, but you do need to demonstrate you are engaged in sustainability in some way. And the requirement to have a CRP will likely come into play in the near future, and other buyers may need it as well. So we definitely recommend that it's a good idea, that it's something to get started with. If you're selling as part of a consortium, each member of the consortium must provide their own CRP. It's no good having an overarching one for all 5 companies. Each individual company needs one. If you are an SME and you lack data, you may be able to have an exception to providing this by providing an explanation of why you don't have the data and how you will get it. Similarly, if your company is very new, it's been trading less than 12 months, you don't need a fully fleshed out CRP. A commitment to net zero and saying that you will publish a CRP in the near future will be sufficient. CRP is a pass-fail assessment, so if you don't provide a CRP that meets the NHS's criteria, you just won't be able to sell to them. It's a pre-qualification criteria for individual procurement and for frameworks. So a lot of the time the NHS will put out a framework which will then make it quicker to apply for a specific tender, and it's at that stage that the CRP will be assessed. So onto the big question, how do you create a carbon reduction plan? It's a very iterative process. Step 1 is to calculate your annual carbon footprint using a baseline year. So you could, if you've got the data from previous years and you want to look back, you could pick 2019, 2020, but typically the easiest thing to do is to pick the last financial year. So for most companies, that would be 2022 at this stage. We strongly advise that you document how you created this carbon footprint. That makes it very auditable, makes it very easy for new hires to pick up, makes it very easy if there are any questions to answer those questions. And so what we mean by procedure is like a list of where all the data was gathered from and how it was inputted either into a spreadsheet calculation, a carbon footprinting tool, or a bespoke in-house model. And once you've done that and you've got your footprint, you can create a sustainability strategy with specific actions that you can put into your carbon reduction plan that you can then show graphically. Baseline year, we were here. We're then going to implement solar panels, so we'll be here. We're going to implement a sustainable business travel policy, so we'll be here, and just showing that gradual reduction. And one very key thing to point out is that net zero does not mean zero emissions. I know that's slightly confusing, but what net zero means is that you've driven your emissions down as close to zero as possible, and then you offset the remaining emissions with high quality carbon offsets. So that does also need to be part of your sustainability strategy for your carbon reduction plan. And then once you've got that in place, over time, you're going to implement these carbon reduction actions, and you'll monitor your progress and update your carbon reduction plan, showing the changes that you've made. And each year, you will calculate your carbon footprint, and that's the best way to show the reduction. It's a very, one of the other reasons this is a very iterative process is a lot of businesses are growing. So you may be at the start of this journey with one manufacturing facility, and in 2, 3, 4 years' time, you may have 2 facilities. And so it's reasonable that your emissions will increase because your production has increased. Or you may switch from doing in-house training to webinars, so the source of your emissions will change. So you need to constantly update these plans and demonstrate the impact of your changing business upon your emissions. For your CRP to be successful, to get that pass from the NHS, we strongly advise setting a 2045 net zero target. and that your carbon reduction actions are SMART. So that's specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, and time-bound. So an example of a SMART action for a business with a manufacturing facility could be in 2025, we will install solar panels on our roof, which will reduce our scope 2 emissions for electricity by 35%. So it's very specific. We're putting in solar panels. It's measurable. Have we done them by the date? It's actionable. It's very clear. We're just going to put solar panels in. It's relevant because it's reducing the emissions of that facility, and it's time bound because you've said you're going to do it by 2025. Linking your CRP to your company's sustainability strategy helps keep it relevant to your company's operations and keeps it in mind and makes it something that it's standard procedure to go back, monitor, and update. Getting independent verification helps provide surety that the footprints have been created using accurate data in line with standards such as the PAS standard for carbon footprinting or the ISO standard for carbon footprinting. Again, there's links to all these standards in the appendix, and I'll be sending the slides around after this presentation. There's also information in the appendix on the Evergreen Supplier Assessment Tool, which is a tool provided by the NHS to allow clear communication between suppliers and the NHS. So strongly recommend checking out the links in the appendix after this presentation. There are other benefits to having a robust carbon reduction plan. So other buyers, not just the NHS, are requiring this. So as previously mentioned, the UK has a legally binding net zero by 2050 target. That means that all government contracts from national government are requiring companies to provide a carbon reduction plan. Again, I think at the moment this is just for tenders worth more than 5 million, but that will be soon changed to all tenders, so all suppliers to government. Local government has similar requirements, but in some cases their net zero target may be even more ambitious. So I believe Manchester, it's 2038, for example. So if you want to sell to Manchester City Council, you will need to demonstrate your carbon reduction plan that is in line with their net zero by 2038 target. And several supermarket chains are bringing this in. So Tesco is quite a notable one. I believe M&S and Co-op are also looking at doing things like this. Carbon reduction plan can also help you attract investment, whether that's from private equity, from banks, or from shareholders. So we've done work with Triodos Bank. Triodos Bank have a net zero target, so everybody that they lend money to must demonstrate that they are on that net zero journey. And so if you have a carbon reduction plan and you approach a bank like Triodos and ask for a loan, that's something that they'll be asking to see. And if you've done it already for your NHS procurement strategy, you'll be able to just show it on demand. Similarly, a lot of private equity investors are looking for the same kind of things. And if you are a publicly traded company, having this kind of plan in place can allow your shares to be put in exchange traded funds, ETFs, that are specific to ESG companies. So it's a really great way of boosting your stock price. And finally, having a robust carbon reduction plan can improve operating efficiency, because if you've pulled all the data together to create a carbon footprint that covers all areas of your operations, you've got all of that data that relate, and carbon correlates very strongly to cost. So if you have a lot of emissions from electricity, it's likely that you're spending a lot of money on electricity, for example. So implementing energy efficiency measures not only reduces your carbon footprint, but also your operating costs. So many reasons to put a robust carbon reduction plan in place, not just to enable you to sell to the NHS. How can we help? So at Innovative Energy Consultants, we are here to help companies like yours. We can calculate carbon footprints. We have bespoke in-house methodology. We also have a number of carbon footprinting softwares that we're able to recommend. Once that's in place, we can analyze your carbon footprint to identify opportunities to reduce your carbon emissions, and we can work with you to develop sustainability strategies and action plans that are relevant to your business. Once those are in place, we can create a carbon reduction plan that is in line with the NHS's requirements or any other buyer's requirements, and monitor your progress along that plan. We can also help with training and with implementation. So we won't install solar panels, but we can help you find somebody that can, and we can also take a look at the carbon reduction promises that vendors are making and help you understand how they apply to your business. So those were all my main points. So if anybody has any questions, I'd like to invite you to either put them in the chat or to come off mute and ask them. Yes, Sinead.
Hi, I wondered if is there a kind of standard template for this? How, what should the carbon reduction plan kind of look like? Are there defined headings, something like that?
Yes, so the first thing that the carbon reduction plan needs is your baseline carbon footprint. And then the second thing it needs is a list of actions that will be taken and how they will reduce your carbon footprint. There isn't really a standard template for this, but what there is the evergreen tool that I mentioned. So if you go on if you type in Evergreen Sustainable Supplier Assessment Tool, that's a really good guide for putting it in a format that fits with the NHS's guidelines for how they're going to judge the applicability of your carbon reduction plan. So if anybody else has got any questions. How did the NHS verify the baseline? Thank you, Sarah. Spot checks. So I think this is quite a new requirement. It's, in my opinion, it's pretty analogous to financial accounting in that today all companies produce accounts, and those companies that are above a certain size will need to be audited by independent financial auditors. That hasn't really evolved today for carbon accounting, but it's on its way. So I think over the next few years, we will be seeing the NHS come out with more fixed verification criteria. But as it is today, it's just part of their procurement requirements where they'll look at it, and if they don't find it's believable, they will ask you for more evidence. Question from Nikki. How does it work with partnerships with companies bidding or responding together? So that's the consortia piece. So the NHS require that every member of a consortia have their own carbon reduction plan. So in partnerships, all companies within that partnership will need to have their own carbon reduction plan that needs to be in line with the 2050, if not the 2045 target. Otherwise, so if there's a consortium of 20 companies and 19 have it and one doesn't, the entire bid will be invalidated. So it's really, really important when you're working in partnership to make sure that everyone you're working with does have a CRP in place.
Just heading back to Sinead's question, when we talked about the Evergreen Supplier Matrix assessment, there is actually a matrix that exists, and I think it's in the appendices. If not, we can include it in the slide pack and send it round. And this is it, yeah. So there are different levels, and I'm sure you can read about it on this matrix, but basically you don't, these are suggestions from the NHS on how to become more sustainable. It's not necessarily a requirement, but you can see each level builds on the next, and this is the kind of way that they're thinking about it. And if you phrase your CRP in line with this matrix, I think they will appreciate that, and it will make it easier and more standardized going forward.
Thank you, Katie. I'd forgotten we'd put that slide in. But as you can see, this is a rapidly evolving landscape, and as time goes on, the criteria are becoming more and more stringent. And so we really strongly recommend that everybody, even if you don't need that CRP today, you at least get your carbon footprint in place. At the back of procurement notice, yes, I think there is one at the back of the procurement notice. So also in the appendix, we've got a list of sources with links. So when we send this round, if you click on these links, you'll be able to see the legal guidance and the templates. Question from Sinead. What is the requirement for different suppliers into a company for each product? Okay, let's flick back to the roadmap slide. So in 2028, there will be carbon footprint requirements for carbon footprinting of individual products. So into a company. Sinead, I just want to check I'm understanding your question correctly. Are you asking if there's... Oh yeah, if you come off mute, that'd be easier.
Sorry, it was just if you're a company and you buy, supplies in, when do those companies that supply you to make your product have to, what's the requirement for a CRP from them?
That is a fantastic question. Now I've understood it. So today, that would be incorporated in the supplier's scope 3. So let's imagine that I am a supplier of glasses to the NHS, water glasses to the NHS, and I buy glass as a raw material from a supplier. If I am a supplier of a product to the NHS, my supplier's emissions are my scope 3 emissions. So if I've bought glass as a raw material from a supplier, I will need to calculate how much carbon has been emitted by my supplier and incorporate that into my scope 3. And that's coming into play in April 2027, where the full scope 3 needs to be incorporated into the carbon reduction plan. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I'm just thinking that might be quite challenging for some companies. So will that drive, hopefully that will drive all companies to be sort of compliant with that, otherwise they're going to lose business.
Exactly. And so the way that you can do that is if your supplier has a carbon intensity metric. So say the supplier of glass is able to tell me that they emit 3 grams of CO2, 3 kilograms of CO2 for every 100 pounds of product that they sell, and I know I spend £1,000 with them, I can calculate the scope 3 emissions using that. But if they don't have a carbon intensity metric, what I'll need to do is I'll need to use an industry standard for glass manufacturing and make that assumption, and that will need to be documented in my carbon footprint, that's how I've calculated that carbon emission. So as you can see, there's a lot of sources of uncertainty in carbon footprints because a lot of the time you are relying on data from your own suppliers, and that's why it's super important to document every assumption that's been made, because if there is a change in your footprint because your supplier has now been able to provide a carbon intensity metric that's actually higher or lower than the industry standard, you need to be able to explain that change if somebody audits you or questions your footprinting. And we are seeing a trend that carbon footprints are being more stringently audited. More buyers, not just the NHS, are starting to ask questions, but it's very, very early on in that process. And we do expect to see this increase over the next 2, 3, 4 years.
Thanks.
Brilliant questions, everybody. Final opportunity to ask questions.
I might have a quick question. I'll just come off of mute. It's easier. It's just thinking out loud in terms of, I mean, as services operating for the NHS, and I think I know you know what we do, but if we're proposing or responding to a bid around people services and we don't really have products, I suppose, that we're necessarily saying are going to, that we can, like glass is your example, right? We have the office that we work in, and we work from home in between, but we're selling expertise in terms of people and services around that. I'm just sort of in my brain going like, how do you then start putting together the carbon reduction plans and trying to then compete around that, I suppose? I don't know. It just seems almost intangible to me to some extent. So it might seem like a silly question, but trying to get my head around it, it almost seems easier when you're selling products because there's actual information, and we're in a shared office space. So do we report on the entire office space? Do we report on our space that we're in? It starts becoming a cutting between fine hairs, but that's I don't know.
So that is a challenge for many service providers. You're not alone in that. A lot of people in shared office spaces. So we've done a lot of work with companies that have been in shared office spaces that have either wanted to put in sub-metering so that they could understand how much energy their particular part of the office was using, or they wanted help in coming up with a methodology to make a reasonable assessment of what share of the building's emissions belong to their business. It is a challenge, and it's often made easier when you can find allies within your building. So if several tenants are coming to the property manager and saying, look, I've got this requirement to show my carbon emissions, we need to, because there are very accessible sub-metering solutions out there. There's also relatively straightforward ways to make reasonable estimates, but sometimes it does require a little bit of cooperation from the landlord, because sometimes in these shared office spaces, the energy costs are included in the rent and the landlord doesn't want to share those costs. So the more tenants can kind of come together, and if you've got 4 or 5 different tenants of the building saying, I really need this information because it's vital to my business winning these contracts, we've found that landlords are a little bit more likely to be helpful when it's more than just one company asking. Which I think,
Thank you.
welcome. But yeah, it's a great point. None of us can do this alone. Sustainability is becoming sustainable, reaching net zero is a very complex and difficult challenge that no individual or company is going to achieve by themselves. We all need to work together. This is a team effort. So on that note, I will ask one last time, any more questions? Well, if any questions occur to people after this webinar, please do not hesitate to get in touch by email. Our contact details can be found on the Contact Us page of this slide. There's the general email, info@innovative-energy.org, but you can also email me at eleanor@innovative-energy.org, or any of my colleagues. So we've got Katie, Bella, and Ellis on the line, and similarly, they're all name@innovative-energy.org. And you can visit our website where we've got blogs and information on how to build a carbon footprint, on how to a bit more detailed breakdown on the different scopes, and you can book in a complimentary 30-minute consultation to help work out how we can help your business become more sustainable. So thank you all so much for your time today, and really hope that you have learned a little bit about the NHS's requirements from this webinar, and you'll be able to put that into practice to win some of those tenders. Thank you.